This episode of EWA Radio is sponsored by the Collaborative for Student Success. EWA retains all control over our editorial content. This is EWA Radio, the official podcast of the Education Writers Association, and I'm public editor Emily Richmond. In 33 states, there is no legal requirement for a teacher to disclose to a potential employer whether they've ever been investigated for any reason, including sexual misconduct. That's something the federal education department is pushing to change. In the meantime, that's allowed some bad apple teachers to stay in classrooms or be moved discreetly from one position to the next, a practice known widely among educators as passing the trash. We're going to talk today about one case involving a popular journalism teacher at a high school in Southern California, and the former student, now a seasoned investigative reporter, who brought what had long been whispers and rumors out of the shadows and into the spotlight. He's Matt Drange, a senior correspondent with Business Insider, and he joins us now. Matt, welcome to EWA Radio.
Thank you so much for having me, Emily.
I want to start with some background. You grew up in California, graduated from Rosemead High School just east of Los Angeles in 2007. Give us a sense of that school community.
Sure, absolutely. So Rosemead, like much of the San Gabriel Valley, is a largely working class community. And for the last 20, 30 years, is a very diverse community as well. A lot of immigrant families live there. The school is predominantly Asian and Latino and has been that way for, like I said, probably the last 30 years or so, and was that way when I was there in the early 2000s.
I want to start right at the top here and say that the teacher we're going to be talking about, Eric Burgess, resigned from Rosemead High School in 2019. The Los Angeles County Sheriff's Office is investigating him in the wake of your reporting. No criminal charges have yet been filed. Your reporting is based on records, emails, and interviews with dozens of people with firsthand knowledge of Mr. Burgess's actions over 2 decades, including your own knowledge. What spurred you to dig into this?
What spurred me to dig into this was actually another reporter's story. A friend of mine, Bethany Barnes, published a great story in 2017 in August called Benefit of the Doubt about a teacher in Oregon where she was based who, for many years, the students and others on campus had raised red flags about his problematic behavior, but he was always given the benefit of the doubt. And when I read that story, this was, keep in mind, the summer of 2017, really, I think the height of the Me Too movement and awareness around that. I read that story and I just had the strangest feeling of deja vu. And I couldn't really place why, but I just had this very, very strong urge to say, you know what? I wonder if there are any teachers like this at my high school. And I didn't know that I would be looking at my journalism teacher, but I knew that because I went to school there, because I knew what the community was like. And what I mean by that is the blurred boundaries on campus was a very open part of the culture there. Kids, including myself, would get rides home from teachers. Teachers would often hang out with students after school or at events, at fundraisers. Students and teachers were very friendly. And so I knew that, and I figured, there were probably some teachers who took advantage of that, but I won't know unless I go and try to find out. So maybe I should go and look and see what I can find.
The reporter you're talking about, Bethany Barnes, now at the Tampa Bay Times, was named the nation's best beat reporter in the EWA Awards just a couple years ago. And I would say lots of education reporters would be inspired by her story. But you are not an education reporter.
That's correct. No, I'm not. And in fact, far from it. So for the last 10 years, I've been based here in Silicon Valley, where I am today. I am largely a business reporter. And so when I began looking into this story, really up until just a few months ago, so 4 years, it was really a side project. It was actually going to be a freelance story, and something that I did just on nights and weekends. That when I initially started, I actually had an idea with a former classmate of mine, who's also a journalist. She works at the New York Times. When we initially started this together, I said, hey, do you think maybe we could just get some disciplinary records? I work a lot with public records, so I know how those work, even though I don't know how a lot of education reporting works, but I know how public records work. And so I thought, well, what if I can just get some public records and then maybe we can pass them along to the student newspaper staff and say, hey, here's some documents about teachers on campus. We're not sure what they'll say, but might be the basis for a story, and we could sort of help mentor and guide those students. That was the initial idea. So when I began, I thought, well, maybe I'll just spend a few months on this, give it to the students, and kind of help shepherd a story with them. But that obviously wasn't going to happen once I realized that one of the teachers, the primary teacher that I would be looking at, was my journalism teacher, who still oversaw the student newspaper at that time.
What kind of questions did you have to ask yourself before you really dug in and pursued this story?
I don't know that I asked myself that many questions because I didn't know how personal it would become. I think most of my questions at the beginning were such that I would ask of any story. What kind of records can I get? Who can I speak with? How can I understand the context here? I'm far away. I'm in the Bay Area. Who can really give me a lay of the land there? And what can I glean that would give me an indication of whether or not this is a story that has legs, whether or not there's really a there there. But from a personal standpoint, I don't know that I asked myself that many questions at the beginning because, again, I just sort of figured it would be a few months, it would be a side project, wouldn't really become that big a part of my life. And of course, I was wrong about that.
When you were thinking about passing on the documents to the student journalist, was that the only time you tried to give away the story?
No, what happened was, fast forward a couple of years after I began reporting, at that point I knew that the story was going to focus on Eric Burgess, on my former teacher. And I was told by a former boss of mine at a publication I worked for at the time that I couldn't do the story. They were worried that it would be a distraction from my day job covering the tech industry. And so at that point, I knew there was an important story to be told. And I really, obviously I didn't want that story to go untold, even if I couldn't tell it. And so at that point I called several friends of mine at large publications, at big national newspapers. And I said, hey, I have this really interesting story. Would you be interested? I'll give you these documents and my notes. And, would you want to run with it? And I had several friends tell me, Matt, this sounds like a great story, but oh my gosh, it would be so much better if you told it yourself. You need to figure out a way to tell it yourself. And so I in hindsight, thankfully, I listened to those friends and I kept reporting the story anyway, again, on the side, and I just continued forward.
Eric Burgess had a big impact on you personally. You've spoken publicly about this. This wasn't just a teacher from whom you took one class in high school and moved on.
Yeah, Eric Burgess was a big part of my family's life. As I say in the story, he became close with my younger brother when he was going through a difficult time in his life. He paved the way for me to, as a high school journalist, fly to Detroit to interview the head coach of the NFL team, the Detroit Lions, who was an alum of Rosemead High School. Which is something that I don't think most high school student journalists get to do, is, get on a plane and take a reporting trip. I would say he was one of a few teachers on campus who really kind of opened the way for my own confidence to grow. My senior year, when I was the sports editor of the school newspaper, I got a part-time job at McDonald's, like a lot of kids do, to save money to buy a car so I could get the heck away from Rosemead. And when I did that, I started work at a time when I was supposed to be in his class. And so I told him about that, and I knew that I could tell him about that, and I knew that he would be okay with me ditching class because he knew that I would get my assignments done at night after work. He became the sort of trusted adult, I think, in my family that, and I should say here too, both my parents are teachers themselves. So they saw him as the type of trusted adult that every parent wants their kid to have at school.
Can you give us just briefly a rundown, if you will, of these really substantial allegations that have been lodged against this teacher about the kinds of relationships he had and some of those outcomes?
The first story about Eric Burgess really laid out 20 years of grooming teenage girls for sex. So I confirmed he had 3 relationships with students over that time frame. One while she was still a student of his, and the other 2 just weeks after they graduated. I investigated other students as well, and I'm continuing to look into other students as well to this day who may have had sexual relationships with him. But the story focuses on those 3 women, as well as a lot of behavior that was just very much out in the open over that time. So Eric Burgess was a fun-loving teacher. He loved to push the boundaries at school with pranks and jokes. I remember when I was in his class, he loved to tell the jokes that began with "your mom," and then fill in the blank. He was sort of seen by a lot of kids as sort of like a fun uncle or perhaps older brother. I think that was particularly the case too before my time on campus, when the age difference wasn't so much. He's in his early 50s now, but when he started teaching, he was in his 20s. And so I think a lot of folks that I've talked to who were close to him have felt, he never really grew up in a lot of ways. And so the story talks about a lot of that behavior as well, and the response or lack thereof from administrators when a lot of these red flags were raised, including perhaps most poignantly in 2018 when the Rosemead principal, who's still the principal today, a man named Brian Bristol, received a very stark whistleblower memo that laid out essentially those 20 years of relationships that I mentioned, that I reported out and found to be accurate and truthful. Well, when the principal received this memo, he sat on it for a year and did nothing. It wasn't until this 2019 when HR department in the district received the memo that they then alerted the LA Sheriff's Department to say, hey, we have this alarming memo, would you be interested in looking into this? So the response from school administrators over the years, I think, is one that many people on campus and parents and students as well feel has been severely lacking.
You relied heavily on these documents to build a very detailed digital trail, text messages, emails that were very important to building your narrative. I want to talk about the opposition from the district and efforts to block you. What were some of those roadblocks and how did you overcome them?
Probably some of the biggest roadblocks to my reporting, and I imagine many, if not most, education reporters who listen to this conversation will relate to, were denials of public records requests. But some of them were, I think, particularly anti-transparent. So, for example, towards the end of my reporting, I sought copies of yearbooks. I wanted to find some old photos that we might be able to use in the story, which we did. And the school librarian, I have this in emails, was told by the principal to not show me these yearbooks, which are a matter of public record and generally wouldn't be hard to get. So I ended up having to get them from the local public library instead, which didn't have as many years as I was hoping because the school stopped giving them yearbooks at a certain point. But, it got to that level of trying to block my reporting. Many of the sources that I have on campus at this point, I've talked to, I think, over 40 people who currently work there. Many of them have been told at various points not to speak with me, to send any questions that I send or any communications up to their district office. They've had a private communications firm as well that's crafted some of the statements both during my reporting and since. And to this point, they largely actually have not really acknowledged or responded to the reporting very much. They issued a statement the day after the story, which, when many staff and students were expecting some sort of apology, said, for the most part, we did all we could.
We're talking with Matt Drange of the Business Insider about investigating sexual misconduct by a teacher at his own high school. If you're looking for other education podcasts, join the Collaborative for Student Success this summer on the Route K-12 podcast, where they will travel the country showcasing the ways federal recovery funds are reshaping our schools. Hosted by Jim Cowan, the Collaborative's executive director, guests will include education commissioners, district superintendents, and other folks who can help figure out where and how the funds are flowing. Jim will hear from parents about their concerns, share some insights and information that could help improve education where you live, and hopefully have some fun along the way. Look for the Route K-12 Exploring Education Recovery podcast wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts weekly, starting on June 13th. Matt, one of your sources described this teacher as, quote, just kind of a big kid in a teacher's role. And as a reporter who's covered sexual misconduct by teachers in multiple states, that description set off an alarm bell for me. I'm guessing it did also for researchers who study these kinds of cases, as well as the law enforcement personnel who investigate them.
I think that's right. Yeah, I think that's fair to say. Typically with child groomers, there are steps taken before the grooming behavior begins. And from talking to experts, I know that often those steps mean ingratiating yourself with both the students and the adults in the room, which obviously can take different forms. So with the students, Eric Burgess was always very, like I said, very jovial, joking, constantly pushing the boundaries, was sort of seen as like a cool uncle or big brother. But he took a different approach with the adults, was very involved with the union, very outspoken, helped shape their curriculum. And these were some of the things that I think kind of in hindsight, when I look at it and I think of this idea of what got me started, this idea of benefit of the doubt. Well, to get the benefit of the doubt in any situation in life, I think you have to take steps. That's earned. It isn't generally just given. And so one of the things that I didn't really set out to do in telling this story, but that experts who have read it have told me I did, is present a very compelling case of what grooming actually looks and feels like, because there are things and steps long before the sexual behavior that really set it up and make the environment such that that behavior can take place. And often, actually, I think that behavior isn't written about that much, isn't explored that much in the press, from what I have read. And perhaps you would know better than me, but that's something that I think is really interesting and that I hope people can talk about. And I know that many readers, both in and around education and also folks who have nothing to do with education and just are worried about their school, have been thinking about lately.
It's such an interesting point you raise here, Matt, because you're right. This is not a case of a stranger grabbing a kid off the street and, God forbid, forcing them into their car. There's an established relationship that takes time to build, and therefore there are red flags that if you miss, you should go back and look at that blueprint.
Absolutely. I think, to put a fine point on it, many of my friends and people close to me who read the story have said, reading the story, you destroyed a part of my childhood. I learned a lot from Eric Burgess. I was close with him. And now I look back and I think about those interactions, and I can't help but think, were they really genuine? Was I being used as a means to some other end? A lot of people are grappling with that right now in my community.
And I'm sure some of that, Matt, is going through your own mind. I mean, hindsight is 20/20, but writing the story, you had to revisit your own memories of your time in high school. What was it like to look back for clues or signals you just may not have understood as a teenager?
It was difficult. I think for me, really from the beginning, and from or shortly thereafter, when I knew that the story would, when my reporting took a turn and I started looking closely at Eric Burgess, I had this nagging feeling of guilt. And the guilt was really, for me, rooted in, why didn't I ask more questions when I was a teenager, when I was 17? I remember girls in my class who became close to him and who I knew had problems at home. A lot of the, all of the women in the story, as I say, all had various struggles at home. This is, again, very common for students who become victims of sexual abuse, is they have various traumas in their life before that happens, typically, and they're vulnerable, perhaps more vulnerable than other students. And I knew of girls like that when I was a student, and when I saw that they would become close with Eric Burgess, I just figured, well, they probably need some help, and here's an adult who's giving them help. I had no idea what he was capable of until I started reporting the story. But what drove me personally, I think, was this feeling of, maybe I should have asked more questions when I was younger, but also knowing as a reporter now, and I've been a reporter ever since I was sitting in Eric Burgess's classroom 15 years ago, I knew that I know today that I probably wouldn't have known what to do with those answers had I gotten them at the time. I was 17 years old, a teenager preoccupied with my own problems at school. So even though I have this feeling of guilt, I know that it may not necessarily make sense from a logical standpoint, but obviously that's not how guilt works. And so for me, that was the biggest feeling, I think, throughout this process.
What advice do you have for reporters who are trying to build trust with individuals who may have been through a traumatic experience like the ones you're describing? How do you do that?
Gosh, that's a great question. The short answer is, it really depends on the source. Some sources are much more forthcoming and ready to tell a story, and many sources are not. For example, the woman in the story who we call Sarah, I reached out to her many, many, many times before she actually agreed to meet with me. And it wasn't until I realized that we had a mutual connection, a former classmate of mine who was in between her age and mine, and who was a TA for her in a class. And I remember playing kickball with him in elementary school. And so I called up this friend and I said, hey, this is what I'm doing. I'm working on this story. It's very important. Is there any way you can help put me in touch with Sarah? I'm using air quotes here, Sarah. And he said yes. And he understood what I was working on. And he said, have you, like many others I spoke with on campus, have you looked at this other teacher too? Because I heard things about him. I think that was me sort of, I almost get emotional even just talking about it because it's my school, but I think it's me tapping into that collective guilt that people at Rosemead have of, maybe I should have looked. Maybe I should have asked more questions too. And so a lot of people, I think, felt that. And that was a big part of the story, I think.
We've talked about the sheriff's office has launched an investigation. You mentioned that the school district has been largely silent. What's been the other reaction to your story?
I think the story, has had a visceral reaction with a lot of different folks. So, I think for the campus alumni community, many of them are outraged. There's a group of them, I think at this point over 100, that are organizing and working on a petition to demand that steps be taken to ensure student safety. I think a lot of the district employees on campus are very upset and feeling like this lack of transparency that district and school officials have had in addressing the story is a big problem and needs to be addressed. There was a school board meeting just last night where several people raised that concern. And then more broadly, it's been, I would say, it's fair to say, just a deluge of inbound from readers. At this point, I think my editor told me more than 8 million people have read the story. And many of the emails and calls and texts that I've gotten have been from victims of sexual abuse and feeling like they too want to share their story. Some of them are folks back home in the Rosemead community and in that school district. Some of them are across the country and across the world. But I think for many of them, what prompted them to call me was this feeling, for them, a lot of them had told me, hey, I have Google alerts set for stories like this. My friends send me stories of when a teacher is caught abusing kids, which is unfortunately all too common of a story. But I think it was this first person aspect where I looked at my school combined with this is what grooming actually looks and feels like. This is the weight of it that people haven't really seen before quite in that way. And so I think a lot of people just wanted to talk to me. I had a lot of conversations that I'm not sure if I'm going to talk to that person again. They just wanted to share their story, to hear me out, to ask me questions. And so it was a very strong visceral reaction for a lot of people, particularly victims of this type of abuse, who felt, I think, very seen and could relate with the women in my story quite a lot.
Lauren Camera of U.S. News recently wrote about a new push by the federal education department to force states to stop shielding teachers who are accused of sexual misconduct. As she mentions, there's no national database for states to share that kind of information. Did that fact surprise you when you found out?
I don't think so. No, I mean, I'm, as an investigative reporter, I think most of us are pretty pessimistic by nature. Government agencies often aren't set up to talk to one another in ways that would be productive. I do think, though, that it's interesting when you look at the states like here in California, where so-called pass the trash, as you mentioned earlier, attempts to pass that legislation have been unsuccessful. And I'm currently exploring why that is and whether or not those policy conversations may be revived by this Department of Education report that you mentioned, which was, I think, very illuminating. I know a lot of people have been waiting a long time for it. And the question now is sort of, so what? So we all know that this is a problem. Is anybody going to do anything about it?
As you've mentioned, you do a lot of public records work as part of your quote-unquote day job. You've taught workshops in investigative reporting through the SPJ and the Professional Association for Business Writers. What tips do you have for some of the education reporters listening when it comes to crafting things like effective open record requests or finding workarounds when districts claim FERPA or personnel protections?
I should say, I feel a little bit of imposter syndrome here. I don't know that I have any great ideas. For me, as you said earlier, Emily, a lot of my reporting on this story was source-based in documents that I received from human sources, not from the district. And so much of my reporting with them was me sort of banging my head against the wall and not getting the records that I thought I was owed. I wouldn't say I had a lot of great success, though, so I don't know that there's a lot of lessons to be learned there. But perhaps I can offer one other lesson, though, which is I think that for victims of this type of abuse, of grooming, it's a very delicate thing for the person to wrap their own head around. And I think as journalists, you need to approach those interviews and those conversations with a huge deal of patience and humility, perhaps more so than any other source, even a vulnerable source or a victim of other abuse. And I think the reason is that, for many of these people, they have told themselves in many cases for years, if you're talking about adults who were abused 10, 20, 30 years ago, many of these people have told themselves that they are not victims because it's easier for them to live their lives that way, even though they were victimized. And so I think a lot of my reporting for this story was revisiting open secrets. Things like I knew that Eric Burgess had a child with a former student. I didn't know the details about it, but I knew that. And other people had whispered about that. I think those whispers and that whisper network that I talked about earlier, I think that takes place on most, if not all, high school campuses. And as a reporter, I think you can tap into that by gaining that trust, by spending time with these people, by showing that you care. And I think that perhaps even more so than getting documents, at least here in California, where documents are quite difficult to get, can be more productive to telling these types of difficult stories.
To me, your story, one of the big takeaways is how profound a teacher's impact can be on our lives, for better or for worse. Someone wrote a comment on one of your postings on the story, and they said, I was groomed and abused by a teacher when I was 13. At 60, I still feel the impact of it. And that broke my heart.
Yeah, likewise. I think a lot of people are feeling that now, at least in my community, and I think others too. Now is a time when they can actually speak up about this. After the Me Too movement, there's perhaps a little bit more willingness to put yourself out there, because it's still very difficult. And you can totally understand why. I mean, just look at my school, when these victims, when the campus community first became aware of Sarah's relationship with my former teacher, she was harassed by adults and students alike. It got so bad she had to change her phone number. So the idea that these folks would not want to come forward and share their story is completely relatable and understandable. And I think society as a whole is reckoning with that, long overdue, obviously. But for me, a big part of my goal in doing this story was to spur conversation like that, knowing that, because when I was reporting the story, knowing that every person that I told that had almost the same reaction. I've never had this with another story. The reaction has almost uniformly been, oh my gosh, this is so sad. And it reminds me of, and then fill in the blank, my teacher, my spouse's teacher, my friend's teacher, whoever. It's a universal reaction. And I think that's just a very, very powerful thing that unfortunately isn't going away.
I was not a high school journalism student, but I was an English major, and I can't let this conversation wrap up without mentioning this Shakespearean twist here, which is that the journalism teacher who inspired you to become a journalist, and you are clearly talented at what you do and passionate about the profession, those skills that he imparted to you are what has helped you to pull back the curtain here.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that is a unique thing. I haven't come across that before. I think that's part of what has struck people. I think that my personal relationship with Burgess was on his mind as well. When he heard that I was asking questions about his relationships with young girls, he reached out to me at Facebook at one point to plead for any humanity that I could offer him. And he reminded me of my relationship with him and his relationship with my family. And he said something very strange that I had wanted to ask him about, but I have never been able to ask him about because he hasn't talked to me since. But he said, I suppose a man has to do what a man has to do to make his impact in this world. And I think, I don't know, but I think now that was sort of his way of acknowledging what you just said, which is that there is this sort of poetic irony here almost of he was my journalism teacher.
So after stories like this, I imagine you're hearing from colleagues who are encouraging you to maybe help other reporters look at something similar in their own communities. What's your advice on that front?
I think I would say to those folks, maybe they should ask themselves some questions that I did not at the beginning. And perhaps in hindsight, it might be better for the story that I did not, which is, are they ready for the closeness in which this could hit for home? The story, as I say in the article, was very difficult for people close to me, people in my family, some of my best friends. So the work comes at a cost. And I would just say that I don't know, I wouldn't want to put that sort of burden on anybody. And I don't think you're a lesser reporter if you don't want to look at your high school. I would just say that it's uncomfortably close to some degree. Any local reporter can identify with that when things in their personal life can come up with things at work. I know that's happened to me before when I was a cops and courts reporter in a small town. You're out in the community and people know who you are outside of work. But with this story, when you're looking at your high school and the sources you're calling are former friends of yours, or perhaps former frenemies of yours, or whoever, it's a different level of closeness than I have ever experienced as a reporter. And for me, it really cut both ways. I think in many ways, it really helped the reporting. It really engendered a strong sense of trust with people immediately because they knew that, hey, Matt is of this community. He went to school here. He cares about us. But for the conversations that became difficult when I would push sources for information, or when they were perhaps unhappy with the direction that I was going, or asking me when I started, how could you look at Eric Burgess? You're going to ruin his life. For those sources, I think it's important to remember that they're not just sources, they're people in your life. And so you have to deal with that after the story is done, which can be really uncomfortable.
Matt Drange is a senior correspondent based out of Business Insider's San Francisco bureau. He's received multiple journalism awards and in 2019 was named the best young business journalist in the country by the Society for Advancing Business Editing and Writing. Matt, thank you for making time for EWA Radio.
Thank you, Emily. It was great to be here.
And that wraps up another episode for us. If there's a story or a reporter you want to learn more about, drop us a line. We're at radio@ewa.org. And don't miss next week's very special episode. We get a big announcement coming. You won't want to miss it. If you subscribe, you'll find out before everybody else. The mission of the Education Writers Association is to strengthen the community of education journalists and improve the quality of education coverage. For more than 75 years, EWA has helped reporters get the story right. Have a great week, take good care of yourselves, and thank you for listening.